Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to this quiet corner of history where we slow things down, dim the lights, and let the past wash over you like a warm, slightly musty medieval tide. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to get comfortable. Pull your blanket up. Let your phone settle somewhere nearby. And if you have not already, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time of night it is for you right now. I love knowing where these stories find you. And if this kind of slow, intimate storytelling is something that helps you drift off, please do consider subscribing so you never miss another quiet walk through history. Tonight, we are going somewhere personal. Somewhere most history books gloss over in a polite paragraph before moving on to kings and battles. Tonight, we are going to sit with the women of medieval Europe and ask a question nobody asked them at the time. What were you actually afraid of? Not in the abstract philosophical sense, in the very specific, lying awake the night before sense, because medieval women had a great deal to be afraid of. And much of it began and continued long after the wedding night. So dim the lights a little further. Settle in, and let us begin. Part 1. The moment you realize what you have agreed to picture yourself. You are 16 years old, or perhaps 17, or possibly 14, because in medieval Europe, age was a suggestion rather than a firm boundary when it came to marriage. It is a Tuesday morning. The sky is the particular gray that means it might rain or might not, and you are standing in your family's cottage doing something entirely ordinary. Feeding the chickens, perhaps, or grinding grain, or sitting on a stool mending a piece of linen that has been mended so many times it is more patch than cloth. And your mother walks in. She has a look on her face that you have learned, over the course of your entire life, to be very wary of. It is the look that precedes news. Not necessarily bad news, not necessarily good news, but news that is going to change things. She sits down across from you and tells you that arrangements have been made. You are going to be married. In 3 weeks. In medieval Europe, marriage for women was less a choice than a category of existence, like being a daughter or a sister. For most women, there was no alternative that did not involve the church or extreme poverty. By the 13th century, canon law technically required that both parties consent to a marriage at the altar. But consent, when the alternative was becoming a burden on your family with no other legal status or means of support, was a complicated word. You nodded. You always nodded. 'Cause what else were you going to do? A quirky tidbit. In some parts of medieval Europe, a girl could legally be betrothed as young as 7 years old, with the actual marriage postponed until she was 12, the age the church considered canonical for girls. Historians still argue about how frequently these extremely young betrothals were actually celebrated as full marriages, and the answer appears to be uncomfortably often in noble families, somewhat less so among peasants who needed their daughters to be old enough to work. You set down your mending. The chickens outside are oblivious. Your mother is already talking about arrangements, about what your family will contribute, about the man's family, about what the priest has said. You are listening, but what you are actually doing is running through, in the privacy of your own head, every single story you have ever heard about what happens to women after they marry. Most of the stories are not comforting. Joke number 1. Your mother finishes explaining the arrangements with the phrase, "You will be very comfortable." You have never heard a sentence that contained less information while appearing to contain more. Joke number 2. You ask if you can meet him first. Your mother looks at you as if you have suggested something mildly scandalous, like painting your face or reading a book. Joke number 3. The chicken outside chooses this exact moment to lay an egg directly in your shoe. You take it as an omen but cannot determine whether it is good or bad, which feels appropriate for the situation. Part 2. The man himself. You have now met your future husband. This happened at the church 3 days after your mother's announcement, in what was described to you as a casual introduction. It lasted approximately 4 minutes and was observed by both families, the priest, and what appeared to be most of the village, who had somehow heard about it and arranged themselves at a respectful distance to watch. His name is Thomas, or William, or John. It is almost certainly one of those three. He is older than you, probably by somewhere between 5 and 15 years, because that was considered entirely normal and indeed practical. He has a beard. He smells of his trade, whether that is flour or animals or earth or iron. He speaks to you exactly twice during your 4 minutes together. Once to say something about the weather, and once to say something about the harvest that you did not quite catch. This is the man with whom you are going to spend the rest of your life. From this day forward, legally speaking, you will not exist as an independent person in most parts of medieval Europe. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently in most regions. She could not appear in court alone. She could not make contracts without his agreement. In the eyes of the law, you were going from your father's property to your husband's property, and the transfer was dressed up in flowers and a blessing from the priest to make it feel like a celebration. A quirky tidbit. The legal concept governing married women's status in much of medieval Europe was related to the idea that husband and wife were one person in law, and that person was the husband. Women in some regions retained slightly more legal autonomy than in others, and widows had considerably more independence than wives. Historians still argue about how strictly these rules were enforced at the village level, where practical necessity often meant women acted with more independence than the law technically allowed. But the law was still the law. You go home and sit by the fire. You think about Thomas or William or John. You try to imagine living in his house, sleeping in his bed, cooking his food, bearing his children, managing his household. You try to imagine what he is like when no one is watching, whether he has a temper, whether he is kind, whether he drinks. You have no way to find out. You will find out slowly over the course of years, in the way that people find out about tides by living near the sea. Joke number 1. You ask a girl who knows his family what he is like. She thinks for a long time and says he is steady. You spend the rest of the afternoon trying to decide if steady means reliable or dull or something worse that she's being polite about. Joke number 2. You ask your older sister for advice. She says, just keep the house clean and don't argue in public. This is the entirety of the guidance available to you about how to navigate a lifetime with a stranger. Joke number 3. Thomas, or William, or John sends a small gift to your family as a courtesy. It is a slightly undersized wheel of cheese. You are not sure what this tells you about him. Possibly nothing. Possibly everything. Part 3. The fear of the first night. Let us be honest about what everyone knew and nobody said out loud, at least not in front of you, not directly. They said it around you, in jokes at the well, in the loaded way your aunts looked at each other when they thought you were not paying attention, in the very specific kind of silence that fell in a room when you walked in and a conversation stopped. Everyone knew that the wedding night was going to be difficult. Not difficult in the way that math is difficult, or weaving is difficult, or getting a pig to go where you want it to go is difficult. Difficult in a way that had no comfortable name. In medieval thinking, shaped by the church and by centuries of medical theory borrowed from ancient Greek writers who had thought about women in ways that were not particularly flattering, the wedding night was framed almost entirely in terms of male experience, male rights, and male satisfaction. The concept of the marriage debt, which the church taught seriously and the parish priest discussed in his sermons, held that both spouses owed the other sex on demand. In practice, this meant you owed him whenever he decided, with no particular regard for whether you were willing or tired or ill, or simply not interested. This is not ancient history in the sense of being unimaginable. It is ancient history in the sense of being something we have, thankfully, moved quite significantly away from, at least in legal terms, in large parts of the world. But for the girl standing in her family's cottage 3 days before her wedding, it was simply the reality she was being asked to step into. A quirky tidbit. Medieval medical writers, drawing on ancient Greek sources, believed that women required, and indeed physically needed, sexual activity within marriage to remain healthy, and that the absence of it could cause a medical condition they described in terms that loosely translate to hysteria. This theory conveniently aligned with the Church's teaching about marital debt. Historians still argue about the extent to which this medical framing was genuinely believed versus simply being useful to the men who wrote it down. The answer, as with so many things, is probably both. What nobody told you, and what you desperately wanted to know, was what it would actually be like. Your mother gave you a fragment of advice that was more confusing than helpful. An older woman in the village was somewhat more specific, in a tone of brisk practicality that implied the whole business was roughly equivalent to breaking new boots. You had questions that remained unanswered because asking them would have required using words that well-brought-up girls did not use in conversation. Joke number 1. The night before the wedding, you lie on your straw mattress and try to remember everything you have ever actually observed or overheard that might be relevant to what is coming. Your total sum of useful knowledge fits in approximately 3 seconds. Joke number 2. Your mother comes in for one final conversation about wifely duties. She speaks in a series of euphemisms so elaborate that you end the conversation more confused than when it started. The closest she comes to plain language is the phrase, "You will learn to manage." You intend to hold her to that. Joke number 3. You decide that the best approach is to get through the night, the week, the month, and then reassess. This is, in fact, the best approach. It is also the only approach available to you. Part 4. What they were actually most afraid of here is the truth that sits beneath the wedding night, beneath the awkward jokes and the village gossip and the elaborate rituals and the priest's stern instructions about marital debt. The thing that medieval women were most afraid of was not the first night. It was what came after the first night. It was pregnancy. In medieval Europe, childbirth killed women with a regularity that we find genuinely shocking today, but that people at the time had absorbed into their understanding of the world. Estimates vary, but historians believe that somewhere between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 births in the medieval period resulted in the mother's death. For a woman who might be pregnant 6, 8, 10, 12 times over the course of her marriage, these were not comfortable odds. The cumulative risk, across a lifetime of pregnancies, was substantial. You knew this. Every girl in the village knew this. You had grown up watching it. You had neighbors who had lost their mothers. You had helped tend to laboring women in the way that all women in a village helped each other, because there were no hospitals, and the midwife needed assistance, and this was simply how things were done. You had seen things during those occasions that you did not discuss afterward, things that stayed in your memory with a clarity that daylight activities did not. A quirky tidbit. Medieval midwives had a complicated relationship with the church. On one hand, the church recognized the necessity of midwives, and at various points tried to bring them under clerical supervision. On the other hand, midwives practiced a form of medicine that blended practical knowledge, herbal remedies, charms, prayers, and traditions passed down through generations of women, which made church authorities nervous about the pagan overtones. Historians still argue about whether medieval midwifery was primarily effective, primarily ineffective, or so varied that neither word adequately describes it. What is certain is that skilled midwives saved lives, and unskilled or absent midwives cost them. You think about this during the days before your wedding. You try not to, because thinking about it does not help, but it is there underneath everything else. It is the reason your mother cries at your wedding, and not entirely from happiness. It is the reason the older women at the feast look at you with an expression that contains, beneath the celebration, something more complicated. They are welcoming you into a sisterhood, but the sisterhood has a price, and they know what it is. Joke number 1. You decide to simply not think about it. This works for approximately 45 seconds. Joke number 2. A well-meaning older cousin pulls you aside at the feast and gives you advice about childbirth, delivered with the specificity of someone who has been through it several times and wants you to be prepared. You appreciate the intention. You will be having nightmares about some of the details for the next 6 months. Joke number 3. Your husband-to-be, asked by someone at the feast whether he is hoping for a son or a daughter first, says cheerfully that it does not matter, just so long as it is healthy. You register that this is a kind thing to say. You also register that the producing of it is entirely your problem, and he will have no further role in the matter beyond the initiating event. Part 5. The Long Years of a Medieval Wife. Let us skip ahead, past the first night, which was uncomfortable and brief and not entirely what anyone had described, although you are still not sure what you had expected. Past the first weeks of learning the household, learning the routines, learning which of your mother-in-law's opinions needed to be agreed with and which could be safely ignored if done so in a way that did not look like ignoring. Past the first pregnancy, which announced itself with a wave of nausea that hit you one morning while you were trying to cook porridge and did not meaningfully relent for 4 months. You are now a medieval wife in the full meaning of the term. And the life you are living is not the life of a romantic poem or a stained glass window. It is a life of unrelenting work, measured out in seasons and tasks and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being constantly responsible for the survival of other people. Your day begins before dawn. There is a fire to be lit, because the fire that was banked overnight has gone down, and a cold kitchen is a slow start to everything else. There is water to be fetched, because your house does not have running water, and the well is in the village square, which means at least 2 trips carrying heavy buckets, often more. There is bread to be started, because bread requires time to rise, and if you do not start it early, there will not be bread for the midday meal. And while the bread is rising, there are the animals, and the children, and the mending, and the spinning, and whatever task the season demands in addition to all of these things. A quirky tidbit. Medieval women's work was not considered separate from or lesser than men's work. It was simply different. A housewife who failed to manage her household properly, who let the fire go out, who produced poor bread, who could not keep her children clothed, was subject to genuine social judgment and censure, because the household was her domain and its success or failure reflected on her competence. Historians still argue about whether this responsibility represented a form of power, since women controlled their domestic domain, or simply piled additional weight onto already heavy shoulders. The answer is almost certainly both, and the ratio depended heavily on the individual household. You learn, over the months and then the years, what your husband is actually like. Not the blurry figure from the church introduction or the wedding feast, but the real person with his actual habits and moods, and the specific way he shows kindness and the specific way he shows frustration. He is not what you feared. He is also not exactly what you hoped for. He is a person, complicated and sometimes baffling and occasionally surprising, and you are learning him the way you learned everything else in your life. By doing it every day. Joke number 1. You discover that your husband has exactly one method for dealing with any problem that arises in the household, which is to look at it for a while and then suggest that you deal with it. This turns out to be true for problems ranging from a hole in the roof to a sick child, to a dispute with a neighbor. You deal with all of them. You develop opinions about this, which you keep largely to yourself. Joke number 2. Your mother-in-law visits at irregular intervals and has specific opinions about how you run your household that she does not hesitate to share. You practice the art of nodding in a way that appears to agree while not actually committing to changing anything. This is one of the most useful skills you develop in your first year of marriage. Joke number 3. You receive, approximately once a month, advice from a neighbor, a relative, or a passing stranger about how to manage your husband, your household, your children, your cooking, or your general approach to life. All of this advice conflicts with the previous advice. You nod, thank them, and continue doing things the way you have determined actually works. Part 6. The things nobody warned you about. There are aspects of medieval married life that you were not told about in advance, not because they were secret, but because they were so thoroughly assumed to be part of the arrangement that no one thought to mention them. No one warned you, for instance, about the particular loneliness of it. Not loneliness in the sense of being alone, because you were almost never alone. Surrounded as you were at almost every waking moment by children, neighbors, your husband, customers. If you helped with any trade, animals with no respect for privacy. But loneliness in the sense of being the only person inside your own experience. No one around you was living your specific life. No one was carrying exactly your particular weight of fears and responsibilities and small private thoughts. No one warned you about the cold. Not the winter cold, which you had always known, but the specific cold of living in a stone house with inadequate heating and always having to choose between spending fuel to stay warm and saving fuel for cooking. The cold that settled into your hands and made your fingers ache on mornings when you were already too tired to deal with pain. The cold that meant you slept in your clothes because the bed was the only warm place and you could not afford to change into and out of a night shift. No one warned you about how much of your life would be spent managing other people's fears. Your children's fears when they were sick, and sick children were common and terrifying because you knew what could happen. Your husband's fears about the harvest, about the rent, about the mill or the crops or whatever his livelihood depended on. Your own parents' fears, visited upon you during their own illnesses. Fear was the medium in which medieval life was conducted, and someone had to absorb it and metabolize it and present a calm face to everyone who needed reassurance. A quirky tidbit. Medieval women did not simply sit at home and wait for history to happen to them. Women ran businesses, participated in trade, acted as creditors and debtors, managed properties when their husbands were absent or deceased, practiced medicine informally, served as witnesses, and generally did a great deal more than the historical record, which was kept almost entirely by men, typically gives them credit for. Historians still argue about how to measure women's economic and social contribution in an era when most of it went unrecorded. The answer appears to be considerably more than the formal historical record suggests. You become, over time, someone you would not have entirely recognized as the 16-year-old sitting on the stool with the mending. You are harder in some ways, more patient in others. You have knowledge that your younger self did not, about birth and death and illness and the specific requirements of human beings who depend on you absolutely and express their dependence primarily through demanding things from you at inconvenient moments. Joke number 1. You discover that you have an opinion about grain prices, water rights, the management of the village common, your husband's cousin's business arrangements, and the price the neighboring farmer is charging for his pig. None of these were topics you had previously thought about. Marriage has made you an expert in an enormous number of things nobody asked you if you wanted to know. Joke number 2. Your eldest daughter reaches the age at which you begin to think about her future, and you realize with a sensation somewhere between horror and recognition that you are about to have a conversation with her that is almost identical to the conversation your mother had with you. You resolve to be slightly more specific than your mother was, and slightly less terrifying than your cousin. You do not entirely succeed at either goal. Joke number 3. Your husband, on an otherwise unremarkable evening, says something that makes you laugh. Not a polite laugh or a social laugh, but an actual unguarded laugh. The kind you had forgotten was available to you in this marriage. You file this away as important information. He looks pleased about it for the rest of the week. Part 7. What medieval women found to hold on to it would be wrong to leave you here, in the cold stone house with the aching hands and the unrelenting work and the weight of fears that no one around you fully acknowledged. Because medieval women were not only their circumstances, they were also the things they found within their circumstances to hold on to. They had each other, first. The women of a medieval village formed networks of mutual support that the historical record does not fully capture because it did not think them worth recording. But they were there. The woman who sat with you through labor. The neighbor who brought food when you were too ill to cook. The older woman who taught you which herbs helped with a fever and which ones to avoid, passing down knowledge that kept children alive. The friend who listened when you needed to say something that you could not say anywhere else. These networks were the immune system of medieval women's lives, quiet and invisible, and absolutely essential. They had faith in a way that was more immediate and more textured than we might imagine from this distance. Medieval faith was not the distant formal religion it can appear to be in retrospect. It was lived daily, in prayers over the bread, in the candle lit before a saint's statue when a child was sick, in the specific comfort of a theology that said suffering had meaning, and that the difficulties of this life were not the whole of the story. You may or may not have fully believed every article of doctrine, but the framework that faith provided, the way it gave shape and meaning to suffering and endurance, was genuinely useful in a life that contained a great deal of both. They found small moments of pleasure and even joy, the way people do in all circumstances, because that is what people do. The satisfaction of a loaf that had risen perfectly and baked to a golden crust. The first warmth of spring. A child's face when they were well and happy. A song at a feast when you were not too tired to hear it. A conversation with a friend that contained actual laughter. Small things, but not nothing. Not nothing at all. A quirky tidbit. Medieval women composed songs, told stories, created textiles of genuine beauty, ran households of considerable complexity, negotiated with merchants and landlords in the church, raised children who built the world that came after them, and did all of this while being largely absent from the written historical record. Historians still argue about how to properly account for this invisible labor and these invisible lives in our understanding of the medieval period. The answer is, we are still working on it, and there is a great deal we will never recover. Joke number 1. Your daughter gets married, and at the feast, you find yourself offering advice to her that is more useful than anything you were offered. You cannot tell whether this represents progress or simply the fact that your mother found this particular topic so uncomfortable that she could not speak plainly. Probably both. Joke number 2. Your husband, after a great many years, does something kind that he does not have to do, and that costs him something. You recognize this for what it is, because you have gotten better at reading him, and you feel something that is warm and complicated and defies easy naming. Medieval people did not have a great many words for this particular feeling. You find you do not need one. Joke number 3. You are, at some point in the long middle years of your life, standing at the well with a bucket, in what is recognizably the same posture as the 16-year-old who stood there on the morning after her betrothal was announced. The water is the same. The sky is the same gray that might be rain. And you are not, in any way that matters, the same person. You are not sure whether this is good or simply true. You think, probably, it is simply true, and that this is enough. Part 8. Falling into the quiet. The fire is burning low now, just enough warmth to keep the room from the full weight of the night. The children are sleeping, that absolute sleep that only children and the very tired can manage. Your husband's breathing is the slow rhythm of someone who works hard and sleeps honestly. The village outside has gone quiet, the last dog silenced, the last cart gone past. This is the hour that belongs to no one's demands. Not the church, not the household, not the village with its constant watching eyes. Just you, and the fading fire, and the dark outside the shutters where the stars are doing what stars do, regardless of the difficulties of human beings below them. The medieval women whose lives we have been visiting tonight were afraid of real things. They faced real difficulties. Their fears were not irrational. They were accurate assessments of a world that asked a great deal of women and gave them limited means of refusal. And yet, within all of that, they found ways to be present in their lives. Ways to love what was lovable. Ways to endure what required endurance. Ways to be, in the middle of circumstances that none of them chose, recognizably and irreducibly themselves. You did not choose the world you were born into. But here you are in it, and the night is quiet, and the fire is warm, and somewhere underneath the weariness there is the simple, remarkable fact of still being here. Let your eyes close now. Let the medieval village settle into the distance, its sounds fading like a song moving away down a road. Let the women whose lives we have walked through tonight rest, because they are long past resting now, and they deserve it. All of them. Every one who got up before dawn and kept going. And let yourself rest too. The day is done. Whatever it held, it is finished now, and here you are, arrived at the end of it, intact. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, wherever you are in the world. And I will see you next time for another slow journey into the lives of the people who came before us. Sweet dreams.